Staff Sergeant Kyle Brennan thought he knew exactly what kind of soldier Second Lieutenant Elena Martinez would be when she stepped off that transport vehicle at Fort Carson. He was wrong, and that mistake would come back to haunt him in ways he never imagined when she returned years later as his commanding officer, holding his military career in her hands. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Colorado sun beat down mercilessly on the asphalt as Elena Martinez gathered her duffel bag and surveyed Fort Carson Military Police Station for the first time. At 23, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who'd graduated top of her class at officer candidate school. But there was something else in her dark brown eyes, a determination that spoke of battles already fought and won. Her uniform was immaculate, despite the long journey from Fort Leonard Wood, and her posture reflected the discipline that had carried her through months of rigorous training. Fort Carson's military police unit was housed in a series of concrete buildings that looked like they'd been built during the Cold War and hadn't been updated since. The motor pool stretched out behind the main building, filled with Humvees, patrol vehicles, and the various equipment that kept the base's law enforcement operations running 24 hours a day. It was here that Elena would spend the next 3 years of her military career, or so she thought. Well, what do we have here? The voice came from behind her, dripping with the kind of condescension that immediately set Elena's teeth on edge. She turned to see Staff Sergeant Kyle Brennan approaching, his combat action badge gleaming on his chest and his swagger suggesting he owned everything within a 50-mile radius. At 31, Brennan had been in the military police for 8 years, and he'd made it clear to anyone who'd listen that he didn't think much of the new breed of college-educated officers the Army was producing. Brennan wasn't alone. Behind him walked Corporal Jessica Torres, a compact woman with hard eyes and an expression that suggested she'd already decided Elena was a threat to the established order. To her left was Private First Class Mike Chen, barely 20 years old but already showing the kind of aggressive attitude that suggested he was eager to prove himself to his superiors. And bringing up the rear was Sergeant Danny Walsh, whose reputation for crude humor and questionable judgment had preceded him throughout the unit. Second Lieutenant Martinez reporting for duty, Elena said, her voice steady and professional despite the hostile energy she could feel radiating from the group. She extended her hand toward Brennan, who looked at it for a long moment before grudgingly accepting the handshake. His grip was unnecessarily firm, the kind of power play that telegraphed insecurity more than strength. Martinez, Brennan repeated, letting her name hang in the air like he was testing its weight. Tell me, Lieutenant, what's your background? ROTC? Officer candidate school straight out of college? I bet you've never been in a real fight in your life. Elena kept her expression neutral, though internally she cataloged this first interaction as the opening shot in what she suspected would be an ongoing campaign. I completed my degree in criminal justice at Arizona State University, then went through OCS at Fort Benning. I'm here to learn from experienced soldiers like yourself and contribute to the mission in whatever way I can. Her diplomatic response seemed to irritate Brennan rather than appease him. Contribute to the mission, he repeated mockingly. You know what the mission is here, princess? It's keeping order on a base full of soldiers who've been to war, who've seen things that would make your college professors wet themselves. It's dealing with domestic violence calls at 2 a.m, breaking up bar fights between infantry soldiers who could bench press your entire body weight, and making split-second decisions that could mean life or death. Corporal Torres stepped forward, her voice carrying a sharp edge that suggested years of fighting for respect in a male-dominated field. What Kyle's trying to say, ma'am, is that this isn't like the textbooks. The soldiers we deal with don't care about your degree or your commission. They care about whether you can back up your authority when things get ugly. Elena nodded thoughtfully, recognizing the test for what it was. I understand that, Corporal. And you're right. There's no substitute for experience. That's why I'm hoping to learn from all of you. She looked around the group, making eye contact with each person. I know I have a lot to prove, and I'm ready to earn my place here through hard work and dedication. Her response should have been exactly what they wanted to hear, humble, respectful, and acknowledging their expertise. Instead, it seemed to make the situation worse. Private First Class Mike Chen, who had been quietly observing the exchange, spoke up for the first time.
"That's what they all say," he said, his voice carrying the particular arrogance of youth combined with false bravado. "But when the rubber meets the road, when you're face to face with some drunk infantry sergeant who's twice her size and doesn't want to come quietly, all that book learning goes right out the window." Sergeant Walsh finally joined the conversation, his Brooklyn accent thick with disdain. "I give her 2 weeks before she's crying to the commander about how mean we are to her. These college types, they think they can just show up and command respect because they've got a shiny bar on their collar." Elena felt the first stirrings of the anger that would eventually drive her from Fort Carson, but she pushed it down with the discipline that had carried her through years of academic and military training. "I appreciate your concern," she said, her voice remaining steady, "and I look forward to proving that your doubts are unfounded." As she walked toward the building to report to her new commanding officer, Elena could hear the quiet laughter and whispered comments behind her. She'd faced skepticism before, as a woman in a male-dominated field, as a college graduate in an environment that sometimes viewed education with suspicion, as a young officer trying to earn the respect of seasoned enlisted soldiers. But there was something different about this group, something that suggested the challenges ahead would be more personal and more vicious than anything she had experienced before. Lieutenant Colonel James Harper's office was spartanly furnished, but functional, with military regulations framed on one wall and unit commendations on another. Harper himself was a tired-looking man in his late 40s, whose desk was piled high with paperwork and whose coffee cup suggested he'd been working since well before dawn. "Martinez," he said, looking up from a report he was reviewing, "welcome to Fort Carson. I trust your journey was uneventful?" "Yes, sir. Thank you for the warm welcome." He studied her for a moment, his experienced eyes taking in details that most people would miss. "I'm going to be straight with you, Lieutenant. This unit has been through some changes recently, and morale isn't where I'd like it to be. Some of the NCOs are set in their ways. They're good soldiers, but they can be challenging for new officers, especially young officers." It was a diplomatic way of saying what Elena had already figured out for herself. "I understand, sir. I'm prepared to work hard and earn their respect." "See that you do," Harper replied, returning to his paperwork. "Sergeant Brennan will show you around and get you oriented. Dismiss." As Elena left the commanding officer, she reflected on the conversation. Harper's warning had been carefully worded, but the message was clear. She was on her own. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she would have to face them without expecting support from the top. The rest of her first day was a blur of administrative processing, equipment issue, and facility tours. Brennan was technically professional in his duties, but his attitude made it clear that he was going through the motions rather than genuinely trying to help her succeed. Every explanation was delivered with barely concealed contempt, every question was met with exaggerated patience, and every interaction was designed to reinforce the power dynamic he wanted to establish. That evening, as Elena unpacked her belongings in her quarters, she allowed herself a moment of doubt. The hostility she'd encountered was more intense and more personal than anything she'd prepared for. But as she hung her uniform in the closet and arranged her personal items on the small desk, she reminded herself why she was here. She'd worked too hard and come too far to let a few insecure soldiers derail her military career. What Elena didn't know was that her first day had been carefully orchestrated. Brennan and his crew had already decided that she didn't belong, and they'd begun a plan to drive her out of the unit before she could establish herself. They'd done it before with other officers they deemed unworthy, and they were confident they could do it again. But Elena Martinez wasn't like the others. She had reserves of strength and determination that even she didn't fully understand yet. The battles ahead would test her in ways she never imagined, and ultimately drive her from Fort Carson in defeat and humiliation. But they would also forge her into the kind of leader who could return years later and transform everything they thought they knew about power, respect, and military excellence. The war was about to begin, and neither side knew just how far it would go before it was over.
Elena's second week at Fort Carson began with what she initially thought was a simple mistake. She had been assigned to lead the morning formation, a routine duty that should have been straightforward for any officer with her training. But when she arrived at the designated assembly area at 0630 hours, she found it completely empty. She stood alone in the Colorado morning chill for 15 minutes before Corporal Torres appeared, coffee in hand and a barely concealed smirk on her face. "Oh, Lieutenant Martinez," Torres said, her voice dripping with false concern. "Didn't anyone tell you? We moved formation to the motor pool this morning. Sergeant Brennan thought you knew." Elena felt her stomach tighten, but she kept her voice level. "No one informed me of any change in location." "That's weird," Torres replied, taking a sip of her coffee. "I could have sworn someone was supposed to tell you. Oh well, these things happen." She turned and walked away, leaving Elena to hurry across the base to where the rest of the unit was already halfway through their morning briefing. When Elena arrived at the motor pool, slightly out of breath and clearly flustered, she found Brennan addressing the formation. He looked up as she approached, his expression a perfect mask of professional concern. "Ah, Lieutenant Martinez. So glad you could join us. I was just telling the troops about today's patrol assignments." The snickers from some of the soldiers were barely audible, but Elena caught them. She realized in that moment that her late arrival hadn't been an accident. It had been carefully orchestrated to make her look incompetent and unprepared. It was her first real lesson in the kind of psychological warfare she was facing. The incident at formation was just the beginning. Over the following days, Elena found herself dealing with a series of small but humiliating oversights and miscommunications that always seemed to make her look bad in front of the troops she was supposed to be leading. Her patrol schedule was mysteriously altered without notification, leaving her scrambling to catch up with units that had already departed. Equipment she needed for training exercises was suddenly unavailable, with requisition forms that had somehow never been processed. Reports she submitted disappeared from the system, only to be found days later in the wrong file folders. Each incident was minor enough that it could plausibly be explained as an honest mistake or administrative error. But the pattern was clear to Elena, even if she couldn't prove it. Someone was systematically sabotaging her ability to do her job effectively. The real escalation came during her third week when Elena was assigned to lead a training exercise on traffic control procedures. It was a complex scenario involving multiple checkpoints and coordination between different teams, exactly the kind of leadership test that could make or break a young officer's reputation. Elena had spent hours preparing, studying the base layout, coordinating with other units, and briefing her soldiers on their responsibilities. She double-checked every detail, anticipating potential problems and developing contingency plans. She was as ready as she could possibly be. The exercise was scheduled to begin at 0800 hours with a briefing in conference room B. Elena arrived 15 minutes early to set up her materials and test the audiovisual equipment. But when she tried to log into the computer system to access her presentation, she found out her password had been changed. "Having trouble, ma'am?" Private Chen asked as he entered the room with several other soldiers. His tone was polite, but Elena caught the gleam of satisfaction in his eyes. "Just a minor technical issue," Elena replied, trying to remain calm as she attempted different password combinations. "I'll have it sorted momentarily." But momentarily stretched into 5 minutes, then 10 as more soldiers filed into the room, and Elena continued to struggle with the system. She could feel the restlessness growing among the troops, could sense their confidence in her leadership eroding with each passing minute. Finally, Sergeant Walsh spoke up from the back of the room. "Maybe we should just proceed without the fancy slides, Lieutenant. Some of us have been doing traffic control since you were in college." The laughter that followed was louder this time, and Elena realized she was losing control of the situation. She made a quick decision to proceed with the briefing using only her notes and the whiteboard, but the damage had been done.
What should have been a professional, polished presentation turned into an improvised scramble that made her look incompetent and unprepared. The exercise itself went worse than the briefing. Radio communications were plagued by mysterious static that seemed to affect only Elena's frequency. Equipment failures occurred at precisely the worst moments, and throughout it all, Elena could see Brennan and his crew watching from a distance, their expressions suggesting they were enjoying the show. The breaking point came during the exercise's final phase, when Elena's team was supposed to establish a vehicle checkpoint on the base's main thoroughfare. The scenario called for them to stop and inspect vehicles according to specific protocols. But when Elena tried to radio for backup support, as the procedure required, her communications failed completely. What followed was 10 minutes of chaos as vehicles backed up, drivers became frustrated, and Elena's team struggled to maintain control without the additional manpower they'd been promised. By the time the exercise was called off, Elena's reputation as a leader had been severely damaged, and she could see the satisfaction in the eyes of her tormentors. That evening, Elena sat in her quarters reviewing what had gone wrong, trying to understand how so many things could have failed simultaneously. The technical problems could have been coincidental, but the pattern was becoming too obvious to ignore. Someone with access to radio equipment, computer systems, and exercise coordination was actively working to undermine her. She considered reporting her suspicions to Lieutenant Colonel Harper, but she knew how it would sound. A young officer complaining that her subordinates were sabotaging her would likely be seen as someone who couldn't handle the pressures of military leadership. Without concrete proof, any accusation she made would only make her look paranoid and weak. Instead, Elena decided to document everything. She began keeping detailed notes of every incident, every mistake, and every convenient failure that seemed designed to make her look incompetent. She started arriving earlier, staying later, and double-checking every detail of her assignments. If someone was playing games with her career, she was going to be ready for them. But even as Elena prepared her defenses, Brennan and his crew were escalating their campaign. They'd moved beyond simple harassment and embarrassment. Now they were targeting her professional competence directly. The goal was no longer just to make her uncomfortable, it was to create a documented pattern of failure that would justify her removal from the unit. The psychological pressure was beginning to take its toll. Elena found herself second-guessing every decision, triple-checking every detail, and losing sleep as she worried about what humiliation awaited her the next day. The confident officer who had arrived at Fort Carson 3 weeks earlier was being systematically broken down, and she could feel her self-doubt growing with each passing day. What Elena didn't realize was that her tormentors were just getting started. The incidents she'd experienced so far were merely the warm-up for a campaign of harassment that would eventually drive her from the military entirely. But they were also underestimating the strength and resilience of the woman they were trying to break. Elena Martinez had survived challenges before, and she had reserves of determination that ran deeper than her tormentors realized. The battles ahead would test her in ways she'd never imagined, but they would also reveal the true measure of her character. The harassment campaign was about to enter its most vicious phase, but Elena was learning to fight back in ways her enemies never expected. The incident that would define Elena's breaking point came during her 6th week at Fort Carson, during what should have been a routine domestic violence call in the base housing area. It was 2:30 a.m. when the call came in, a neighbor reporting screaming and the sound of furniture being thrown from one of the military family housing units. Elena was serving as the duty officer that night, which meant she would be responding alongside the patrol team to assess the situation and coordinate any necessary actions. Domestic violence calls were among the most dangerous situations military police faced. They involved highly emotional people, often with combat training and access to weapons, in confined spaces where tensions could explode without warning. The protocols were clear. Approach with caution, separate the parties involved, assess for injuries, and de-escalate the situation while ensuring everyone's safety. Elena had studied these procedures extensively and had even participated in simulated training scenarios during her officer training. But this would be her first real-world domestic violence call, and she could feel her heart rate increase as she climbed into the patrol vehicle with Sergeant Brennan and Private Chen. "Nervous, Lieutenant?" Brennan asked as they drove through the quiet base housing area, his voice carrying its usual undertone of mockery. "These calls can get pretty intense. Hope you're ready for some real police work." Elena kept her response professional despite the clear challenge in his tone. "I've reviewed the protocols, Sergeant. I'm prepared to assist however necessary." Chen snorted from the back seat. "Protocols don't mean much when you've got a drunk infantry sergeant throwing punches and his wife screaming for help, but I'm sure your textbook knowledge will come in handy." The house they approached was a standard military family residence, identical to dozens of others in the housing area. But the sounds coming from inside made it clear this was anything but a normal evening. Through the thin walls, they could hear raised voices, crying, and the occasional crash of something being thrown or broken. Elena's training kicked in as they approached the front door. Standard procedure called for the senior officer to take the lead in making contact, while backup officers positioned themselves strategically around the residence. She was mentally reviewing her approach when Brennan made an unexpected announcement. "Chen, you take the front door. Martinez, you go around back in case anyone tries to run. I'll coordinate from out here and call for additional backup if needed." Elena felt a chill run down her spine. The protocol she had studied called for the most experienced officer to make initial contact, not the youngest and least experienced soldier on the team. Sending her alone to the back of the house during an active domestic violence situation violated every safety guideline she had learned. "Sergeant," she said carefully, "shouldn't we maintain visual contact and coordinate our approach? The protocols recommend—" "The protocols," Brennan interrupted, "are written by people who've never dealt with a real situation like this. I've been doing this for 8 years, Lieutenant. Trust me. I know how to handle a domestic." Elena's instincts screamed that something was wrong, but she was caught between her training and her position as a junior officer. Challenging Brennan's orders in front of Chen would undermine her authority, but following them felt dangerous and wrong. Before she could voice further objections, Brennan was already moving toward the front of the house, leaving her with little choice but to comply with his instructions. Elena drew her weapon and began moving around to the back of the residence, her radio ready to call for immediate backup if the situation deteriorated. What Elena didn't know was that Brennan had no intention of providing her with the support she would need. As she positioned herself behind the house, trying to peer through windows to assess the situation inside, Brennan and Chen were having a quiet conversation at the front door. "Give it 5 minutes, Brennan," said quietly to Chen. "Let her get good and scared back there by herself. Maybe she'll finally realize this job isn't for little girls playing soldier." The situation inside the house was escalating rapidly. Elena could hear shouting getting louder, and through a kitchen window, she caught glimpses of a large man pacing angrily while a woman cowered in the corner. Her training told her they needed to act quickly before someone got seriously hurt, but she was isolated at the back of the house with no immediate backup. That's when everything went wrong. The back door of the house suddenly flew open and a heavily built staff sergeant stumbled out onto the small patio. Elena could immediately see that he was intoxicated, angry, and potentially dangerous. His uniform shirt was torn, his knuckles were bleeding, and his eyes had the unfocused look of someone who'd been drinking heavily for hours. "Military police," Elena announced, her weapon drawn, but not yet aimed directly at him. "Sir, I need you to remain calm and keep your hands where I can see them." The sergeant looked at her with a mixture of surprise and contempt. "Are you kidding me?" he slurred, swaying on his feet. "They sent a little girl to arrest me? Where are the real cops?" Elena keyed her radio to request immediate backup, but instead of Brennan's voice responding, she heard only static. She tried again, but the radio remained silent. Whether it was equipment failure or something more sinister, she was on her own with an increasingly agitated suspect who outweighed her by at least 80 pounds. "Sir, I need you to sit down on the ground with your hands behind your head," Elena commanded, trying to project authority despite the fear growing in her chest. "We can resolve this situation peacefully, but I need you to cooperate." Instead of complying, the sergeant took a step toward her, his expression darkening. "You think that little badge makes you tough? You think I'm gonna let some college princess tell me what to do in my own house?" Elena backed up slightly, maintaining her distance while trying to de-escalate the situation. "Sir, your neighbors called because they were concerned about the noise. We're here to make sure everyone is safe. No one wants this to get worse than it already is."
But the sergeant was beyond reasoning. The alcohol, the domestic situation, and his obvious resentment toward authority were combining into a dangerous mixture. He took another step forward, and Elena could see in his eyes that he was preparing to attack. "Where's your backup, little girl?" he taunted. "Did they leave you all alone to handle the big, scary man?" Elena realized with growing horror that this was exactly what had happened. Brennan had deliberately isolated her in a dangerous situation, probably expecting her to panic and call for help, further damaging her reputation as a competent officer. But now the situation was spiraling out of control, and she was facing a potentially deadly confrontation with no immediate support. The sergeant lunged forward suddenly, moving faster than his intoxicated state should have allowed. Elena had milliseconds to decide whether to use her weapon or try to subdue him through other means. Her training took over, and she sidestepped his charge while calling out commands for him to stop and get on the ground. The physical confrontation that followed was brief but intense. The sergeant was bigger and stronger, but Elena was sober, trained, and motivated by the knowledge that her life might depend on the outcome. She managed to avoid his initial attack and use his momentum against him, but she knew she couldn't maintain the advantage for long. It was only when the sergeant grabbed for her weapon that Elena realized how close she had come to a potentially fatal encounter. The struggle for control of her sidearm lasted only seconds, but it felt like an eternity as she fought to maintain possession while calling desperately for backup that never came. The situation was finally resolved when neighbors, attracted by the commotion, began gathering outside and someone called for additional police units. The arrival of backup officers ended the confrontation, but by then Elena was shaken, exhausted, and beginning to understand the true depth of what had been done to her. As she sat in the patrol vehicle afterward, filling out incident reports and trying to process what had happened, Elena realized that this hadn't just been another harassment incident. This had been something much more serious. A deliberate attempt to put her in a situation where she could be seriously injured or killed. The miscommunication about backup, the violation of standard protocols, and Brennan's convenient absence during the most dangerous moments weren't accidents. They were attempted murder disguised as incompetence. And Elena finally understood that her tormentors weren't just trying to drive her out of the unit. They were willing to see her hurt or killed to achieve their goal. The harassment campaign had crossed a line that would change everything. And Elena knew that her next decision would determine not just her military career, but potentially her life. Elena spent the rest of that sleepless night documenting every detail of the domestic violence incident, meticulously recording the timeline, the protocol violations, and the suspicious equipment failures that had left her isolated and vulnerable. By dawn, she'd compiled a comprehensive report that painted a clear picture of what she believed was deliberate endangerment. She was preparing to present this evidence to Lieutenant Colonel Harper when Sergeant Brennan appeared at her office door. "Rough night, Lieutenant?" Brennan said, settling into the chair across from her desk without being invited. His expression was a careful mask of concern, but Elena could see the calculation in his eyes. "I heard you had some trouble with that domestic call. Equipment failures, communication problems, that kind of thing can really shake up a young officer." Elena studied his face, looking for any sign of genuine remorse or acknowledgement of what had really happened. Instead, she saw only the same cold satisfaction that had been present throughout her ordeal at Fort Carson. "Yes, it was challenging," she replied carefully. "I'm preparing a detailed incident report for the commander." Brennan's smile didn't reach his eyes. "That's good. Very thorough of you. But you know, these things happen in police work. Equipment fails, situations get fluid, and sometimes officers have to adapt on the fly. The important thing is that everyone went home safe at the end of the shift." The casual dismissal of what had nearly been a fatal encounter made Elena's blood boil, but she kept her voice level. "Standard protocols exist for officer safety, Sergeant. When those protocols aren't followed, people can get hurt." "Protocols are guidelines, Lieutenant, not rigid rules.
An experienced NCO sometimes has to make judgment calls in the field. You might want to consider that before you file any reports that could reflect poorly on the team. After all, we all have to work together. The threat was subtle, but unmistakable. Elena realized that Brennan was already working to control the narrative, to frame the incident as a learning experience rather than the deliberate endangerment it had been. But she had documented everything, and she was determined to seek justice through official channels. Elena's meeting with Lieutenant Colonel Harper was scheduled for 1400 hours that afternoon. She arrived precisely on time, her incident report organized, and her evidence clearly presented. Harper listened to her account with what appeared to be appropriate concern, asking clarifying questions and taking notes as she described the protocol violations and equipment failures. "This is serious, Lieutenant," Harper said when she had finished her presentation. "If what you're describing is accurate, we have significant training and equipment issues that need to be addressed immediately." He set down his pen and looked at her directly. "However, I have to tell you that Sergeant Brennan has already briefed me on this incident, and his account differs significantly from yours." Elena felt her stomach tighten. "In what way, sir?" Harper opened a file folder and began reading from what was obviously Brennan's report. "According to Sergeant Brennan, you requested to take the lead on this domestic call as a learning experience. When the situation became challenging, you became overwhelmed and failed to follow proper radio procedures, which delayed backup response. He notes that this is consistent with performance issues you've demonstrated since arriving at the unit." The words hit Elena like a physical blow. Not only was Brennan denying his role in endangering her, but he was turning the entire incident into evidence of her incompetence. "Sir, that's not what happened. I have detailed notes from the scene, and I can document the timeline of events." "I'm sure you can," Harper interrupted, "but we also have Sergeant Brennan's report and Private Chen's corroborating statement. 2 experienced soldiers versus 1 junior officer who's admittedly struggled with some aspects of her duties here." Elena realized with growing horror that the fix was already in. Brennan had anticipated her complaint and had gotten his version of events on record first, complete with a witness who would support his story. Moreover, Harper was clearly more inclined to believe his experienced NCO than a junior officer who was having performance issues. "Sir, I believe there's a pattern of harassment and sabotage that extends beyond this single incident. I have records of equipment failures, communication breakdowns, and administrative errors that have consistently undermined my ability to perform my duties effectively." Harper glanced at her notebook, but didn't reach for it. "Lieutenant, I'm going to give you some advice. This unit has functioned well for years under Sergeant Brennan's leadership. The NCOs here are experienced professionals who've earned their position through competence and dedication."
The dismissal was devastating, but not entirely unexpected. Elena had suspected that the command structure might protect its established personnel, but hearing it stated so bluntly confirmed her worst fears about the system she'd trusted to provide justice. "I understand your concern about unit cohesion, sir," Elena said carefully, "but officer safety should be the top priority. The protocols that were violated exist for good reason, and the protocols," Harper interrupted, "are guidelines that must be adapted to real-world situations by experienced personnel. If you can't work effectively with your NCOs, if you can't earn their respect and trust, then perhaps you need to consider whether you're suited for this type of assignment." Elena left Harper's office feeling more isolated and vulnerable than ever before. Not only had her complaint been dismissed, but it had been turned into evidence of her own inadequacy. The system she'd relied on for protection had instead become another weapon in her tormentor's arsenal. Over the following days, Elena noticed a subtle but unmistakable shift in how she was treated throughout the unit. Word had clearly spread about her performance issues and her complaints about the NCOs. Other officers began avoiding her, unwilling to associate with someone who was seen as a problem. Even soldiers who had previously been neutral or supportive became distant and professional, clearly having received guidance about her unreliability.
The isolation was systematic and complete. Elena found herself excluded from informal briefings, left out of social gatherings, and gradually stripped of meaningful responsibilities. Her duty assignments became increasingly mundane and administrative, keeping her away from situations where her performance issues might cause problems. Meanwhile, Brennan and his crew continued their campaign with renewed confidence. They'd successfully painted Elena as an incompetent officer who blamed others for her failures, and they'd received tacit approval from the command structure to continue their behavior. The harassment became more brazen and more personal, with fewer attempts to maintain plausible deniability. Equipment assigned to Elena continued to malfunction at critical moments. Reports she submitted were lost in the system. Training opportunities were given to other officers without explanation. And through it all, every problem was attributed to her own shortcomings rather than the systemic campaign being waged against her. The psychological pressure was becoming unbearable. Elena found herself constantly second-guessing her decisions, doubting her abilities, and questioning whether she really was as incompetent as everyone seemed to believe. The confident officer who had arrived at Fort Carson 2 months earlier was being systematically broken down, her self-esteem and professional identity eroding under the constant assault. But perhaps most devastating was the realization that she was truly alone. The system that was supposed to protect her had instead become her enemy. The commanders who should have investigated her complaints had dismissed them. The fellow officers who should have supported her had abandoned her. And the enlisted soldiers who should have respected her rank were encouraged to treat her with contempt. Elena began to understand that this wasn't just about harassment or even about driving her out of the unit. This was about breaking her completely, destroying her confidence and her career so thoroughly that she would never recover. It was about sending a message to any other young officers who might challenge the established order: conform or be destroyed. As Elena sat in her quarters that night, surrounded by official reports that painted her as a failure and isolated from any support system, she began to consider a possibility that would have been unthinkable just weeks earlier. Maybe it was time to give up. Maybe it was time to accept defeat and leave the military before the situation got even worse. But even as the thought crossed her mind, something deep inside her rebelled against it. Elena Martinez had never been a quitter, and despite everything that had happened, some part of her still believed in justice, still believed that right would eventually triumph over wrong. The question was whether she could survive long enough to see it happen.
The final incident that ended Elena's first military career came on a gray December morning, exactly 3 months after her arrival at Fort Carson. She had managed to survive the constant harassment, the systematic sabotage, and the institutional betrayal. But what happened that day would prove to be the breaking point that even her remarkable resilience couldn't withstand. Elena was assigned to conduct a routine security inspection of the base armory, a responsibility that should have been straightforward for any qualified military police officer. The armory contained thousands of weapons and millions of rounds of ammunition, making security protocols absolutely critical. Any discrepancies or violations discovered during the inspection could result in serious consequences for both the unit and the individuals involved. Elena had prepared meticulously for the inspection, as had become her habit when dealing with any assignment that might be used against her. She'd reviewed all relevant regulations, coordinated with the armory personnel, and double-checked her equipment to ensure everything was functioning properly. She was determined that this inspection would be conducted flawlessly, leaving no room for criticism or sabotage. The armory staff consisted of 2 experienced sergeants who had been managing the facility for several years. Sergeant First Class Rodriguez was a professional soldier with an impeccable record, while Staff Sergeant Thompson was newer to the position but equally competent. Both had worked effectively with previous inspecting officers, and Elena had no reason to expect any problems. The inspection began normally, with Elena systematically checking weapons storage areas, ammunition counts, and security procedures. Everything appeared to be in order,
with proper documentation and secure storage protocols being followed throughout the facility. Elena was actually beginning to feel optimistic about completing an assignment without incident when she discovered the first discrepancy. In one of the smaller storage rooms, Elena found a weapons rack that contained 17 M4 carbines instead of the 16 listed on the inventory sheet. It was a minor discrepancy that could easily be explained by paperwork errors or recent transfers, but it required investigation and documentation according to standard procedures. "Sergeant Rodriguez," Elena called out, "could you help me reconcile this inventory discrepancy? I'm showing one extra rifle in rack number 7. Rodriguez approached and examined the inventory sheet, his expression showing mild confusion. "That's strange, ma'am. We haven't had any transfers or additions to that rack in the past month. Let me check the master log." As Rodriguez went to retrieve the master inventory log, Elena continued her inspection of the surrounding area. What she found next made her blood run cold. Hidden behind a stack of empty ammunition crates, she discovered something that should never have been in a secured military armory: a small bag containing what appeared to be illegal drugs. Elena's training immediately kicked in. She knew that discovering controlled substances in a secure military facility was an extremely serious matter that required immediate notification of both military police investigators and command personnel. She also knew that any mishandling of this discovery could have devastating consequences for her career and potentially for national security. She was photographing the evidence and preparing to notify the proper authorities when Sergeant Brennan appeared in the storage room doorway. Elena hadn't requested his presence, and he had no official business in the armory during her inspection. But there he was, his expression showing a mixture of surprise and satisfaction that immediately raised her suspicions. "Problem here, Lieutenant?" Brennan asked, his tone suggesting he already knew exactly what Elena had discovered. "I've found some discrepancies that require investigation," Elena replied carefully, not wanting to discuss the details until proper procedures could be followed. Brennan stepped closer, his eyes taking in the photographed evidence and Elena's documentation. "Looks like someone's been using the armory for unauthorized activities. That's a serious security breach, Lieutenant. I hope you followed proper evidence handling procedures." The comment seemed innocent enough, but something in Brennan's tone made Elena's instincts scream danger. She had followed procedures exactly, but she was beginning to suspect that this discovery hadn't been accidental. The timing was too convenient, Brennan's presence was too coincidental, and the entire situation felt like another carefully orchestrated trap. Her suspicions were confirmed when military police investigators arrived within minutes of Brennan's radio call, much faster than would normally be possible unless they had been pre-positioned nearby. The investigators were thorough and professional, but Elena could see in their eyes that they had already been briefed on what they would find and who they expected to find responsible.
The investigation that followed was swift and devastating. Despite Elena's careful documentation and photographic evidence, the narrative that emerged painted her as either incompetent or complicit. How, the investigators asked, could an experienced military police officer fail to secure a crime scene properly? Why hadn't she followed proper chain of custody procedures? And most damaging of all, how could she explain that the drugs had been found during her inspection when previous inspections had found no problems? Sergeant Rodriguez and Staff Sergeant Thompson, when questioned separately, both expressed surprise at the discovery and suggested that Elena's inspection techniques might have been flawed. They weren't overtly hostile, but their statements subtly undermined her credibility and competence. Neither mentioned seeing anything suspicious before Elena's arrival, and both suggested that her inexperience might have compromised the investigation. The most devastating blow came when investigators reviewed the armory's security footage. The cameras clearly showed Elena in the storage room where the drugs were discovered, but due to technical issues, the recordings from the previous week were corrupted and unavailable. This meant that investigators couldn't determine when the drugs had been placed in the facility, but Elena's presence at the discovery site made her a primary suspect. Lieutenant Colonel Harper's reaction to the incident was swift and final.
In a meeting that lasted less than 10 minutes, he informed Elena that she was being relieved of all duties pending a full investigation. Moreover, he made it clear that her future in the military police was in serious doubt, regardless of the investigation's outcome. Lieutenant Martinez, Harper said, his voice carrying none of the diplomatic courtesy he'd shown in previous meetings, this incident represents a complete failure of leadership and professional competence. Whether through incompetence or deliberate misconduct, you've compromised the security of a critical military facility. I cannot and will not allow you to continue in a position where you might endanger personnel or operations. The hearing that followed was a formality. Elena was represented by a military attorney who seemed more interested in negotiating a quiet resignation than mounting a vigorous defense. The evidence against her was circumstantial but damaging, and her previous complaints about harassment were used to paint her as someone who blamed others for her own failures. Faced with the possibility of a court-martial that could result in criminal conviction and imprisonment, Elena accepted a deal that allowed her to resign her commission in lieu of further proceedings. The resignation was characterized as voluntary, but everyone involved understood that it was anything but. She was given 30 days to clear the base and transition to civilian status. The final weeks at Fort Carson were a blur of administrative processing and personal humiliation. Her security clearance was revoked, her access to base facilities was restricted, and her professional reputation was destroyed beyond repair. Fellow officers who had previously been neutral or supportive now avoided her entirely, unwilling to associate with someone who had become a pariah within the military community. As Elena packed her belongings and prepared to leave Fort Carson, she reflected on everything that had been taken from her. She had lost her career, her security clearance, her professional identity, and her faith in the military justice system. The dreams she had carried of serving her country and making a difference had been crushed by a system that protected bullies and punished those who challenged the status quo. But perhaps most devastating was the knowledge that her tormentors had won completely. Brennan and his crew would continue their careers, probably receiving commendations for their role in uncovering security breaches. Harper would move on to his next assignment, his record unblemished by any acknowledgement of his failures in leadership, and the system that had failed Elena would continue operating exactly as it had before, ready to destroy the next officer who didn't fit the mold. On her final day at Fort Carson, as Elena drove through the base gates for the last time, she carried with her a bitterness and anger that would take years to overcome. She had been naive to believe that competence and integrity would be enough to succeed in an environment poisoned by corruption and cronyism. She had learned, in the most painful way possible, that sometimes the system itself is the enemy. What Elena didn't know as she began her journey into an uncertain civilian future was that this defeat would ultimately become the foundation of her greatest victory. The lessons she had learned about institutional failure, the strength she had developed through adversity, and the absolute determination to never let others experience what she had endured would eventually transform her into exactly the kind of leader the military desperately needed. But first, she had to survive the wilderness years that lay ahead, rebuilding her life and her confidence from the ashes of her shattered dreams.
Elena Martinez spent her first civilian Christmas in 5 years alone in a studio apartment in Denver, surviving on savings that were rapidly dwindling and wrestling with a depression that threatened to consume what remained of her spirit. The woman who had once commanded soldiers and conducted complex military operations now struggled to find the motivation to get out of bed each morning. The transition from military structure to civilian uncertainty had been more difficult than she'd anticipated, made worse by the circumstances of her departure and the shadow it cast over her future prospects. Job hunting with a military background that ended in unexplained resignation proved nearly impossible. Potential employers and law enforcement saw the gap in her service record and asked questions she couldn't answer without damaging her chances further. Corporate security positions required clearances she no longer possessed. Even basic administrative jobs seemed to view her military experience as either irrelevant or potentially problematic. The financial pressures were mounting, but the emotional toll was worse.
Elena found herself reliving the events at Fort Carson obsessively, analyzing every decision she'd made and wondering if she could have somehow changed the outcome. The confidence that had once been her defining characteristic had been replaced by self-doubt and a lingering fear that maybe her tormentors had been right about her inadequacies. It was during her lowest point, 3 months after leaving the military, that Elena encountered Master Sergeant Rosa Williams in an unlikely setting, the checkout line at a Denver grocery store. Williams was a decorated military police officer with over 20 years of service, and she recognized Elena immediately, despite the civilian clothes and the obvious changes in demeanor. "Lieutenant Martinez?" Williams said, her voice carrying both surprise and genuine concern. "I heard you'd left the service. How are you doing?" Elena's first instinct was to deflect with polite pleasantries, but something in Williams' expression, a combination of understanding and no-nonsense compassion, made her pause. Here was someone who might actually understand what she'd been through. "I'm managing," Elena replied carefully, though her appearance probably told a different story. Williams studied her for a moment, then made a decision that would change Elena's trajectory completely. "Are you free for coffee? I think we should talk." The conversation that followed lasted 4 hours and covered everything from Elena's experiences at Fort Carson to her current struggles with civilian life. Williams listened without judgment, asked probing questions, and gradually helped Elena understand that her experiences weren't unique or deserved. More importantly, she helped Elena see that her story wasn't over. "What happened to you was wrong," Williams said bluntly, "but letting it define the rest of your life would be an even bigger tragedy. You have knowledge and skills that the military needs, Elena. The question is whether you're willing to fight for the chance to use them." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Williams explained that there were other paths back into military service, routes that could bypass the toxic environment Elena had encountered at Fort Carson. The military was evolving, slowly recognizing the need for leaders who understood both the problems and the solutions. But it would require Elena to rebuild herself completely: her education, her credentials, and most importantly, her confidence. The transformation began with education. Elena enrolled at the University of Colorado, using her GI benefits to pursue a master's degree in public administration with a focus on organizational leadership. The academic environment was initially intimidating after years away from formal education, but Elena discovered that her military experience, even the painful parts, gave her insights that her younger classmates lacked. Her thesis project became a comprehensive analysis of institutional harassment and its impact on military readiness. Elena interviewed dozens of veterans who had experienced similar situations, documenting patterns of abuse and examining successful intervention strategies. The research was painful but therapeutic, helping her understand that her experiences were part of a larger systemic problem rather than personal failings. More importantly, the academic work helped Elena develop the analytical framework and communication skills she would need to address these issues as a leader rather than a victim. She learned to present her experiences not as complaints, but as data points in a larger study of organizational dysfunction and reform opportunities. Her professors recognized her unique perspective and encouraged her to pursue additional opportunities. She participated in leadership seminars, attended conferences on military reform, and began networking with academics and policymakers who are working on similar issues. Gradually, she began to see herself not as a failed officer, but as someone with valuable expertise in identifying and solving problems that plagued military organizations. The physical transformation was equally important. Elena had let herself decline during her darkest months, but she gradually rebuilt her fitness and professional appearance. She returned to the disciplined routines that had once defined her military service, rising early for exercise, maintaining strict schedules, and holding herself to the highest standards in everything she did. But perhaps most crucial was the emotional and psychological transformation. Elena worked with counselors who specialized in military trauma, learning to process her experiences in healthy ways rather than simply enduring them. She discovered that the anger and bitterness she carried were normal responses to genuine injustice, but that they didn't have to control her future decisions. Through this process, Elena began to develop a vision of the kind of leader she wanted to become. She would be someone who protected subordinates rather than exploiting them, who created inclusive environments rather than toxic ones, and who used power to lift others up rather than tear them down. The experiences that had once seemed like pure destruction were being transformed into the foundation of wisdom and empathy. Elena's academic success led to research opportunities with military think tanks and policy organizations. She published papers on leadership development, organizational culture, and harassment prevention that gained attention within military circles. Her work was cited in official reports and referenced in training programs, slowly establishing her credibility as an expert on the issues she had lived through personally. The irony wasn't lost on her that the same experiences that had ended her first military career were now becoming the basis for expertise that could launch a new one. Elena was developing a national reputation as someone who understood both the problems plaguing military organizations and the solutions needed to address them. 3 years after leaving Fort Carson in disgrace, Elena completed her master's degree with highest honors and immediately enrolled in a doctoral program focused on military leadership and organizational reform. But more importantly, she began exploring opportunities to return to active duty through programs designed for professionals with specialized expertise. The military had programs for lawyers, doctors, and other professionals who could enter service at advanced ranks based on their civilian credentials and experience. Elena's academic background, combined with her previous military service and her recognized expertise in organizational leadership, made her an attractive candidate for direct commission programs. The application process was rigorous and required Elena to confront her past head-on. She had to explain the circumstances of her departure from Fort Carson, document her subsequent achievements, and demonstrate that she had transformed her negative experiences into positive contributions to military knowledge and practice. The interviews were challenging, with panels of senior officers who asked probing questions about her resilience, her motivations, and her ability to work effectively within the same institution that had once rejected her. But Elena was no longer the uncertain young lieutenant who had arrived at Fort Carson 5 years earlier. She was a confident, educated professional with a clear vision of how she could contribute to military excellence. The day Elena received notification of her acceptance into the direct commission program was both vindication and the beginning of a new chapter. She would enter the service as a captain with an assignment to a military police unit that was implementing new leadership development and harassment prevention programs, exactly the kind of role her experiences and education had prepared her for. But what Elena didn't know yet was where that assignment would take her. The orders that would arrive 2 weeks later would represent the ultimate irony. She was being assigned to Fort Carson, Colorado, to take command of the same military police unit that had driven her out in disgrace 5 years earlier. The circle was about to close, and Elena Martinez was about to discover what justice really looked like. Elena stared at the official orders in her hands for a full 5 minutes before the reality of what she was reading truly sank in. The Department of the Army letterhead was formal and unmistakable, the language precise and bureaucratic, but the message was clear. Captain Elena Martinez was being assigned to Fort Carson, Colorado, to assume command of the 759th Military Police Company, effective in 30 days. The same unit that had destroyed her first military career was about to become her responsibility to lead, reform, and transform. The irony was so profound that Elena's initial reaction was to laugh, a bitter, incredulous sound that echoed through her Denver apartment like a challenge to fate itself. Her second reaction was panic. Despite all her education, training, and preparation for return to military service, Elena wasn't sure she was emotionally ready to face the people who had driven her to the brink of suicide 5 years earlier. The thought of seeing Staff Sergeant Kyle Brennan again, of walking through the same buildings where she had been systematically humiliated and betrayed, made her stomach clench with anxiety and long-suppressed rage. But as Elena read through the orders more carefully, she began to understand the full scope of what was being asked of her. The 759th Military Police Company wasn't just any unit. It was specifically designated as a pilot program for implementing new leadership development and harassment prevention protocols throughout the Military Police Corps. Elena's assignment wasn't coincidental, it was deliberate. Someone in the Pentagon had decided that the woman who had been victimized by the system was uniquely qualified to fix it. The briefing materials that accompanied her orders painted a troubling picture of the current state of the 759th MP Company. Morale was at historic lows, retention rates were abysmal, and there had been multiple complaints of harassment and discrimination that had resulted in congressional inquiries. The unit that had once prided itself on its efficiency and esprit de corps had become a case study in toxic leadership and institutional dysfunction. Elena recognized the symptoms immediately. The same patterns that had destroyed her own career were now destroying the entire unit. The culture of intimidation and cronyism that had protected her tormentors had metastasized into something that was affecting everyone in the organization. The bullies had won their individual battles, but were losing the war for organizational effectiveness. The personnel files made for sobering reading. Elena discovered that she wasn't the only officer who had been driven out of the unit over the past 5 years. 3 other lieutenants had resigned or been transferred under suspicious circumstances, and 2 senior NCOs had been quietly reassigned after complaints that had been resolved through administrative channels. The pattern of abuse had continued and expanded, creating a reputation that made the unit a dead-end assignment for anyone with career aspirations. But what caught Elena's attention most was what hadn't changed. According to the most recent personnel roster, Staff Sergeant Kyle Brennan was still assigned to the unit, now promoted to Sergeant First Class, and serving as the senior enlisted advisor. Corporal Jessica Torres had been promoted to Staff Sergeant and was leading one of the patrol sections. Private Chen was now a sergeant, and Danny Walsh had been promoted to Staff Sergeant despite what Elena remembered as questionable judgment and behavior. The people who had destroyed her career had not only survived, but thrived within the system that had protected them. They had been rewarded for their behavior with promotions and increased responsibility, while their victims had been driven out or silenced. It was a perfect example of how institutional dysfunction perpetuates itself when there are no consequences for toxic behavior. Elena spent the next 3 days wrestling with the decision that would define the rest of her military career. She could request reassignment, citing personal conflicts or professional concerns that would likely be accepted without question. Her expertise was valuable enough that she could easily be assigned to another unit where she wouldn't have to confront her past directly. But the more Elena thought about it, the more she realized that running away would be another victory for the people who had tried to break her. More importantly, it would mean abandoning the soldiers currently serving in the unit to the same toxic environment that had nearly destroyed her. If she truly believed in the principles of leadership and justice that she had spent 5 years developing, then this assignment was her opportunity to prove it. Elena made her decision on a cold February morning while reading about another young officer who had committed suicide after being subjected to hazing and harassment at a different military installation. The story was heartbreakingly familiar. A promising career destroyed by institutional indifference and toxic leadership. Elena realized that she had been given not just an opportunity for personal vindication, but a chance to prevent others from experiencing what she had endured.
The preparation for her return to Fort Carson was meticulous and comprehensive. Elena studied every regulation, policy, and procedure related to military police operations and leadership development. She reviewed case studies of successful organizational transformations and consulted with experts who had led similar reform efforts in other military units. She developed detailed plans for addressing the cultural issues that had plagued the unit and created measurable objectives for improving morale, retention, and operational effectiveness. But Elena also prepared herself emotionally and psychologically for what lay ahead. She worked with counselors who helped her process the trauma of her previous experience while maintaining the professional objectivity she would need as a commanding officer. She practiced scenarios where she might encounter her former tormentors, rehearsing responses that would be firm but professional, authoritative but not vindictive. Most importantly, Elena refined her vision of the kind of leader she wanted to be. She would not seek revenge against the people who had wronged her, but she would hold them accountable for their professional conduct going forward. She would not allow past grievances to interfere with mission accomplishment, but she would ensure that the toxic culture that had enabled abuse was completely dismantled and replaced with something better. Elena's friends and mentors had mixed reactions to her assignment. Some worried that she was setting herself up for failure by taking on such a challenging situation with so much personal history attached to it. Others argued that she was uniquely qualified to succeed where others had failed because she understood the problems intimately and had the motivation to fix them completely. Master Sergeant Rosa Williams, who had become Elena's most trusted advisor during her transformation years, was characteristically direct in her assessment. This is either going to be the making of you as a leader, or it's going to destroy you completely. The question is whether you're strong enough now to handle what's coming. Elena's response was equally direct. I'm not the same person who left Fort Carson 5 years ago. I'm stronger, smarter, and I have a mission that's bigger than any personal grievances. Those people tried to break me once, and they failed. Now I'm going to show them what real leadership looks like. As Elena packed her belongings and prepared for the journey back to Colorado, she reflected on the remarkable turn her life had taken. The naive lieutenant who had once believed that competence and integrity would be enough to succeed had been replaced by a seasoned officer who understood that true leadership required courage, wisdom, and an uncompromising commitment to doing what was right, regardless of personal cost. The drive to Fort Carson would take her through familiar landscape, past landmarks that held painful memories and reminders of her previous defeat. But this time, Elena would be arriving not as a victim seeking acceptance, but as a commander with the authority and responsibility to create the kind of organization she had always believed the military could be. The circle was closing, and Elena Martinez was finally ready to complete the journey that had begun 5 years earlier with her humiliating departure. This time, she would not be driven out in defeat. This time, she would transform the battlefield itself.
Captain Elena Martinez stepped out of her government sedan at Fort Carson on a crisp Monday morning in March, her captain's bars gleaming in the Colorado sunlight and her uniform pressed to perfection. At 31, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had been tested by fire and emerged stronger. The woman who had left this place in disgrace 5 years earlier bore little resemblance to the officer who had returned to transform it. The first person to recognize her was Sergeant First Class Kyle Brennan, now wearing the chevrons that marked him as the senior enlisted leader of the unit he had once helped destroy. Elena watched his face cycle through surprise, disbelief, and something that might have been fear as he processed the impossible reality of her return. The swaggering bully who had once terrorized a young lieutenant was now looking at a captain with the authority to end his career with a single recommendation. "Ma'am," Brennan said, his voice carefully controlled but unable to hide the shock in his eyes. We weren't expecting you until this afternoon." Elena studied his face for a moment, noting the way his usual arrogance had been replaced by uncertainty. "I arrived early, Sergeant First Class. I wanted to observe the unit's normal operations before announcing my presence." She paused, letting the implications sink in. "I hope that won't be a problem." "No, ma'am, of course not," Brennan replied, but Elena could see the wheels turning behind his eyes. How much had she seen? What had she observed? And most importantly, how much did she remember about their previous encounters? The transformation in the base was immediately apparent to Elena as she walked through the facilities that had once been the scene of her humiliation. The motor pool that had witnessed her first confrontation with Brennan now showed signs of poor maintenance and low morale. Equipment that should have been spotless was dirty and poorly maintained.
Soldiers moved with the listless efficiency of people going through the motions, rather than the crisp professionalism she remembered from her early days in the military. Staff Sergeant Jessica Torres appeared as Elena was inspecting the administrative offices, her hard expression faltering when she recognized her new commanding officer. "Captain Martinez?" Torres said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I thought... we heard you had left the Army." "I did leave, Staff Sergeant," Elena replied, her tone pleasant but carrying an undertone of steel. "I spent 5 years in civilian life, earning advanced degrees and studying organizational leadership. Now I'm back, and I've been specifically assigned to transform this unit into a model of military excellence." She looked directly into Torres's eyes. "I trust I can count on your full cooperation in that effort?" Torres nodded mutely, clearly struggling to process the dramatic reversal in their positions. The woman she had once helped torment was now her commanding officer, with the authority to end her career with a single recommendation. Elena's first official meeting was with the outgoing commander, Major Patricia Stone, who briefed her on the unit's current status and challenges. The picture that emerged was even worse than Elena had expected from reading the files. Morale surveys showed that the 759th MP Company ranked in the bottom 5% of all military police units. Retention rates were so low that the unit was constantly understaffed. Most damaging of all, the unit had developed a reputation throughout Fort Carson as a place where good soldiers went to have their careers destroyed. "I won't sugarcoat it, Captain," Major Stone said wearily. "This unit is a mess. The senior NCOs run their own little kingdom with minimal oversight, and anyone who challenges the status quo gets marginalized or driven out. I've tried to implement changes, but the resistance has been overwhelming." Elena nodded thoughtfully. "What kind of resistance, ma'am?" "The subtle kind that's hard to prove but impossible to ignore. Equipment failures during my initiatives, communication breakdowns that isolated me from the troops, and administrative errors that made me look incompetent. Sound familiar?" Elena's expression didn't change, but internally, she felt a cold satisfaction. The same tactics that had been used against her were now being employed against other officers who tried to reform the unit. The cancer had metastasized, but that also meant the symptoms were now impossible to cover up or ignore. "I understand completely, ma'am," Elena said, "but I have some advantages you didn't have. I've studied this unit extensively. I understand exactly how the dysfunction operates, and I have explicit authority from higher headquarters to make whatever changes are necessary." That afternoon, Elena called her first formation as commanding officer of the 759th Military Police Company. She stood before the assembled soldiers, many of whom remembered her from her previous assignment, and delivered a speech that would be remembered for years afterwards.
"Good afternoon, soldiers," she began, her voice carrying clearly across the formation. "My name is Captain Elena Martinez, and I am your new commanding officer. Some of you may remember me from my previous assignment here 5 years ago. For those who don't know the history, I was a second lieutenant in this unit who was systematically harassed, sabotaged, and ultimately driven out of the military by toxic leadership and institutional indifference." A murmur ran through the formation as soldiers processed what she was saying. Elena could see Brennan's face pale and Torres shift uncomfortably, but she wasn't finished. "I spent the next 5 years earning advanced degrees in organizational leadership and studying the very problems that destroyed my first military career. I've written papers on institutional harassment, advised senior leaders on cultural transformation, and developed programs that are being implemented throughout the military. And now, I've been specifically assigned to return here and fix the problems that once drove me away." Elena paused, letting her words sink in before continuing. "I want to be clear about my intentions. I am not here for revenge. I am not here to settle old scores. I am here to transform this unit into an organization that lives up to the highest standards of military excellence. An organization where every soldier is treated with dignity and respect, where competence is rewarded and toxicity is eliminated, and where we accomplish our mission through professional excellence rather than fear and intimidation." She looked directly at Brennan as she delivered her final point. "To those who have contributed to the toxic culture that has plagued this unit, you have a choice. You can embrace the changes we're going to implement and become part of the solution, or you can resist and find yourselves facing consequences that your previous victims never had the authority to impose. But make no mistake, the culture that allowed abuse and harassment to flourish is ending today." The formation was dismissed in complete silence, with soldiers filing away in small groups to discuss what they had just heard. Elena had fired the opening shot in what would be a comprehensive campaign to transform the unit, and everyone understood that the rules of the game had fundamentally changed. As Elena walked back to her office, she caught sight of Brennan, Torres, and several other former tormentors huddled in intense conversation near the motor pool. She could imagine what they were discussing: how to undermine the new commander, how to protect themselves from accountability, and how to preserve the system that had given them power over others. But Elena was no longer the naive lieutenant they remembered. She was a seasoned officer with advanced education, explicit authority from higher headquarters, and most importantly, a complete understanding of their tactics and methods. The hunters had become the hunted, and Elena Martinez was about to show them what justice really looked like when wielded by someone with both the power and the wisdom to use it effectively. The transformation of the 759th Military Police Company was about to begin, and this time, the bullies would not be the ones writing the final chapter.
Elena's first week as commanding officer was a masterclass in professional warfare. While her former tormentors expected either vindictive revenge or inexperienced flailing, they instead encountered something far more dangerous: systematic, methodical accountability delivered with surgical precision and unassailable professionalism. Elena's strategy was simple but devastating. Rather than pursuing personal vendettas, she would hold everyone in the unit to the same high standards of military excellence, documenting every failure and rewarding every success with absolute consistency. The people who had thrived in a system that rewarded cronyism and intimidation would now have to succeed based purely on merit and competence. The first casualty of Elena's new order was Sergeant First Class Kyle Brennan himself. Elena began by conducting a comprehensive review of his performance over the past 5 years, a process that was entirely within her authority as commanding officer and completely consistent with standard military practices for senior enlisted leaders. What she discovered was damning. Brennan's performance evaluations, when examined closely, revealed a pattern of declining standards and questionable judgment that had been overlooked or excused by previous commanders. His leadership of the motor pool showed consistent equipment readiness problems, maintenance shortcuts, and safety violations that had been covered up through creative reporting and administrative manipulation. "Sergeant First Class Brennan," Elena said during their first private counseling session, "I've reviewed your performance records and observed your leadership style firsthand. I have some concerns about your effectiveness in your current position." Brennan shifted uncomfortably in his chair, clearly struggling to adapt to being held accountable by someone he had once terrorized. "Ma'am, I've been running the motor pool for 3 years without any major incidents." "Without any reported incidents," Elena corrected, pulling out a thick folder of documentation. "However, my review shows 17 safety violations that were administratively resolved, 12 equipment failures that were attributed to normal wear rather than maintenance deficiencies, and consistent complaints from subordinates about your management style." She opened the folder and began reading specific examples, each one documented with dates, witnesses, and photographic evidence where applicable. Brennan's face grew increasingly pale as he realized the thoroughness of Elena's investigation and the weakness of his position. "Furthermore," Elena continued, "I've discovered that your method of resolving problems often involves intimidating subordinates into withdrawing complaints or accepting substandard conditions. This is not leadership, Sergeant First Class. This is abuse of authority." The counseling session concluded with Brennan receiving his first negative counseling statement in 5 years, along with specific performance objectives that would be monitored closely. Elena made it clear that his future in the unit, and possibly in the military, would depend entirely on his ability to meet professional standards, rather than his skill at political manipulation. Staff Sergeant Jessica Torres faced similar scrutiny, but Elena's approach with her was subtly different. Torres had been a follower rather than a leader in the harassment campaign, and Elena sensed that she might be salvageable if approached correctly. Staff Sergeant Torres, your technical skills are excellent, but your leadership approach needs significant adjustment. I've reviewed your section's performance, and while the numbers look good on paper, the human cost has been substantial. Torres looked confused. Ma'am, my section has the highest arrest rates and the fewest complaints. The fewest official complaints, Elena corrected, but when I interviewed your soldiers confidentially, a different picture emerged. High performance achieved through fear and intimidation is not sustainable leadership. It creates short-term results at the cost of long-term effectiveness and morale. Elena presented Torres with feedback from anonymous surveys and confidential interviews that revealed widespread dissatisfaction within her section. Soldiers were afraid to report problems, reluctant to take initiative, and planning to leave the military at the first opportunity. The success Torres thought she had achieved was actually a carefully maintained facade that was destroying the unit from within. I'm giving you an opportunity to transform your leadership style. You have 90 days to demonstrate that you can achieve the same results through positive leadership, mentorship, and professional development of your subordinates. If you can't make that transition, I'll recommend you for reassignment to a position more suited to your current skill set. The message was clear. Torres could evolve or be removed, but the old way of doing business was no longer acceptable. Sergeant Mike Chen, now revealed to be as insecure and incompetent as Elena had suspected, crumbled under the first real scrutiny he had ever faced. When Elena reviewed his work performance objectively, she discovered that his apparent competence had largely been a product of other people covering for his mistakes and taking credit for his successes.
Sergeant Chen, Elena said during his counseling session, your performance record shows a concerning pattern of errors, missed deadlines, and substandard work that has been consistently overlooked or excused. This stops now. Chen's response was predictable. Blame everyone else, make excuses, and attempt to deflect responsibility. But Elena had dealt with his type before and was prepared with specific examples and documentation that made denial impossible. You have 30 days to demonstrate significant improvement in your performance, Elena told him. During that time, you'll receive additional training, closer supervision, and mentorship designed to help you succeed. But if you can't meet minimum standards, I'll initiate proceedings for administrative separation from the service. Elena's approach to accountability extended beyond her former tormentors to encompass the entire unit. She implemented comprehensive performance tracking systems that measured not just individual competence, but also leadership effectiveness, unit cohesion, and soldier satisfaction. The metrics she had developed during her academic years were now being applied to create an objective picture of who was contributing to mission success and who was detracting from it. The results were illuminating. Several soldiers who had been marginalized or overlooked by the previous leadership structure emerged as top performers when given proper opportunities. Others who had been favored by the old regime struggled to meet basic standards when they couldn't rely on favoritism and intimidation to mask their deficiencies. Elena also implemented regular counseling sessions with every soldier in the unit, not just those with problems. She wanted to understand the full scope of the cultural issues she was addressing and identify potential leaders who had been suppressed by the previous toxic environment. The goal isn't punishment, Elena explained to her newly appointed first sergeant, a competent NCO who had been transferred in specifically to support her reform efforts. The goal is transformation. Some people will rise to meet higher standards, and some will be revealed as unsuited for military service. Either way, the unit becomes stronger. But Elena's reforms went beyond individual accountability to address the systemic issues that had allowed the toxic culture to flourish. She implemented new reporting procedures for harassment complaints, created anonymous feedback mechanisms, and established clear consequences for retaliation against soldiers who reported problems. Most importantly, she began rebuilding the unit's sense of purpose and pride. Rather than focusing solely on what was wrong,
Elena emphasized the positive mission of the military police and the important role each soldier played in maintaining order and security on the base. The changes weren't universally welcomed. Several soldiers who had benefited from the old system resisted Elena's reforms through passive resistance and attempts to undermine her authority. But Elena had dealt with this type before and was prepared with specific examples and documentation that made resistance both futile and self-defeating. As the weeks passed, the unit began to transform in ways that were visible to everyone on the base. Equipment readiness improved dramatically, soldier complaints decreased significantly, and the 759th MP Company began to develop a reputation for professional excellence rather than toxic dysfunction. Elena's former tormentors found themselves in an impossible position. They could either embrace the changes and potentially salvage their careers, or they could continue their resistance and face increasingly severe consequences. But the choice was theirs to make, and Elena was content to let their own actions determine their fates. Justice, Elena had learned, wasn't about revenge. It was about creating systems where good people could succeed and bad behavior had consequences. And for the first time in years, justice was being served at Fort Carson.
6 months into Elena's command, the transformation of the 759th Military Police Company was nothing short of remarkable. The unit that had once been a byword for dysfunction and toxicity was now being studied as a model for successful organizational reform. But perhaps more importantly for Elena personally, she was witnessing something she had never experienced during her first assignment at Fort Carson: genuine respect earned through competent leadership. The changes were visible everywhere. The motor pool that had once been a source of constant equipment failures was now running at 97% readiness, the highest rate on the entire base. The barracks that had echoed with complaints and low morale now housed soldiers who took pride in their service and looked forward to coming to work each day. Most significantly, the 759th MP Company had gone from having the worst retention rate in the military police corps to having a waiting list of soldiers requesting transfer into the unit. Elena's office had become a different kind of gathering place than it had been under previous commanders. Instead of being a place where soldiers were called to receive punishment or criticism, it was now where people came to discuss professional development opportunities, seek mentorship, and contribute ideas for further improving the unit. On this particular morning, Elena was reviewing the latest performance metrics when Staff Sergeant Jessica Torres knocked on her door. The woman who had once participated in Elena's harassment campaign now carried herself with a confidence and professionalism that would have been unrecognizable 6 months earlier. "Ma'am, could I have a moment of your time?" Torres asked, her tone respectful but comfortable, the mark of a healthy command relationship. "Of course, Staff Sergeant. What's on your mind?" Torres took a seat, organizing her thoughts before speaking. "Ma'am, I wanted to update you on the leadership development program we discussed last month. The junior soldiers in my section have been responding incredibly well to the mentorship approach, and I think we're ready to expand it to other sections." Elena smiled, remembering how different this conversation was from their first counseling session 6 months earlier. Torres had been Elena's success story, a talented soldier who had been corrupted by toxic leadership but was capable of remarkable growth when given proper guidance and clear expectations. "That's excellent news, Staff Sergeant. What specific changes have you observed?" "Well, ma'am, the soldiers are taking more initiative, they're more willing to report problems early before they become major issues, and most importantly, they seem to actually enjoy their work now. We've had 3 soldiers in my section request extension of their assignments here, which never happened before." Elena nodded approvingly. "And how do you feel about the changes in your own leadership style?" Torres was quiet for a moment, clearly thinking carefully about her response. "Ma'am, can I be completely honest with you?" "Always, Staff Sergeant." 6 months ago, I thought good leadership meant making people afraid to disappoint you. I thought if soldiers weren't a little scared of me, they wouldn't perform. But you've shown me that real leadership means making people want to exceed your expectations because they respect you and believe in the mission. Torres paused, then continued more quietly. "I also want to apologize again for how I treated you doing your first assignment here. I was wrong, and I'm ashamed of my behavior."
Elena appreciated the continued acknowledgement, but more importantly, she was proud of the professional Torres had become. Staff Sergeant, what matters is who you are now and how you lead going forward. You've demonstrated that you can change and grow, and that's what I value most. The conversation was interrupted by a knock on the door. Elena's first sergeant, Master Sergeant Williams, who had requested transfer to Fort Carson specifically to work with Elena, entered with the morning briefing materials. Ma'am, I have the latest reports from all sections. Torres, good to see you. I hear your section's performance metrics are off the charts again. Torres beamed with pride at the recognition. Thank you, First Sergeant. The soldiers deserve all the credit. They've really embraced the new approach. After Torres left, Elena and Williams reviewed the unit's overall status. The picture that emerged was one of sustained improvement across all measurable categories, but Williams had something specific on his mind. Ma'am, I wanted to discuss Sergeant First Class Brennan with you. Elena looked up from her paperwork. Brennan had been her most challenging case, too senior and too set in his ways to transform easily, but too experienced to simply discard without giving him every possible opportunity to improve. How is he progressing with his performance improvement plan?
Williams pulled out a detailed assessment. It's complicated, ma'am. His technical competence has improved significantly. The motor pool runs better than it has in years, but his leadership style is still problematic. He meets the letter of his counseling requirements, but I don't think he truly understands or embraces the changes we're implementing. Elena had suspected as much. Brennan had been complying with her directives, but she could see that he was going through the motions rather than genuinely transforming his approach to leadership. He was competent enough to avoid administrative action, but he wasn't contributing to the positive culture she was trying to build. What's your recommendation, First Sergeant? I think we should offer him the opportunity to transfer to a different unit, where his technical skills can be utilized without requiring him to adapt to our leadership model. It would be presented as a lateral move that recognizes his expertise, while acknowledging that this particular environment isn't the best fit for his leadership style. Elena considered the recommendation. It was exactly the kind of solution she had hoped to implement, giving people opportunities to succeed in environments better suited to their capabilities, rather than simply punishing them for not fitting a particular mold. I agree. Draft the paperwork and schedule a meeting with Sergeant First Class Brennan. I want this to be presented as an opportunity, not a punishment. The meeting with Brennan 2 days later was professional, but honest. Elena explained that while his technical performance had improved significantly, she felt he would be happier and more successful in a unit that valued his traditional approach to military leadership. Sir, Brennan said, using the formal address that had replaced his previous casual insubordination, I appreciate what you've accomplished here, and I understand that I don't fit into your vision for the unit. I think a transfer would be beneficial for everyone involved. Elena was struck by the change in Brennan's demeanor. He wasn't the swaggering bully she remembered, but he also wasn't the reformed leader that Torres had become. He was simply a professional soldier who had learned to operate within the new system while maintaining his personal distance from it. Sergeant First Class, I want you to know that your technical contributions have been valuable, and I'll ensure that your next assignment recognizes your expertise appropriately. As Brennan left her office, Elena reflected on the different paths people had taken during her command. Some, like Torres, had embraced the changes and grown into better leaders. Others, like Chen, had been unable to adapt and had been administratively separated from the service. And still others, like Brennan, had found ways to coexist with the new system without truly joining it. But the most remarkable transformation had been in the soldiers who had been oppressed by the previous system. Elena had watched quiet, marginalized soldiers emerge as natural leaders when given opportunities and support. She had seen creativity and initiative flourish in an environment that rewarded excellence rather than conformity. That evening, as Elena walked through the unit area conducting her routine end-of-day checks, she encountered a scene that perfectly captured the transformation she had achieved. A group of junior soldiers was gathered around Sergeant Torres, who was providing impromptu leadership counseling to a young private who had made a mistake during the day's operations. Instead of the fear and humiliation that would have characterized such interactions under the previous leadership, Elena observed patient mentorship, constructive feedback, and genuine concern for the soldier's professional development. The private was learning from his mistake rather than being crushed by it. And Torres was demonstrating the kind of leadership that Elena had always believed the military could embody. As Elena continued her walk, soldiers throughout the unit greeted her with genuine respect and enthusiasm. These weren't the forced pleasantries of people afraid of their commander, but the natural interactions of professionals who valued their leader and took pride in their organization. For the first time since arriving at Fort Carson 7 months earlier, Elena allowed herself to feel truly satisfied with what she had accomplished. She had not only transformed a toxic unit into a model organization, but she had proven to herself and others that justice was possible within military institutions when leaders had the courage and competence to pursue it.
2 years after Elena's return to Fort Carson, the 759th Military Police Company had become a legend within military law enforcement circles. What had once been a case study in organizational dysfunction was now the subject of academic papers, leadership seminars, and congressional commendations. But for Elena, the true measure of success wasn't found in awards or recognition. It was found in the lives and careers she had helped transform. Elena stood in her office on a crisp October morning, reviewing the latest transfer requests. For the third consecutive quarter, more soldiers were requesting assignment to the 759th MP Company than any other unit in the Military Police Corps. The waiting list had grown so long that senior commanders were using assignment to Elena's unit as a reward for top performers throughout the Army. Master Sergeant Williams knocked and entered, carrying the morning briefing folder that had become a source of consistent good news over the past 18 months. "Ma'am, I have the quarterly metrics you requested, and I think you're going to be very pleased with what you see." Elena accepted the folder and began reviewing the data that told the story of organizational transformation in stark numerical terms. Retention rates had increased by 300%. Disciplinary incidents had decreased by 90%. Most remarkably, soldier satisfaction scores had gone from the bottom 5% Army-wide to the top 1%. A transformation that military sociologists had declared unprecedented in modern military history. "These numbers tell an incredible story, First Sergeant," Elena said, "but what I value most are the personal success stories. Tell me about the soldiers." Williams smiled, knowing exactly what Elena wanted to hear. "Staff Sergeant Torres just received notification that she's been selected for the Sergeant First Class promotion list 6 months ahead of her peers. More importantly, she's been chosen to attend the Advanced Leadership course, where she'll help develop training programs for other NCOs based on the leadership model we've implemented here." Elena felt a surge of pride at Torres's success. The woman who had once participated in harassment campaigns was now being recognized as a model leader whose methods would be taught throughout the military. It was perhaps the most satisfying validation of Elena's belief that people could change when given proper guidance and clear expectations. "What about our junior soldiers?" Elena asked. "That's where the story gets really interesting, ma'am. Remember Private Johnson, the one who arrived here 8 months ago after requesting transfer from a unit where he was being harassed? He's now being recommended for promotion to corporal, and 3 other soldiers have specifically requested to work in his team because of his leadership potential." Elena remembered Johnson well, a quiet, competent soldier who had been marginalized and bullied in his previous assignment. Under the culture Elena had created, his natural leadership abilities had flourished, and he had become exactly the kind of NCO the Army needed. His story was being repeated throughout the unit, as soldiers who had been suppressed by toxic environments discovered their potential in a culture that rewarded merit and character.
The success stories extended beyond individual careers to encompass the broader impact Elena's reforms were having on military culture. The leadership principles she had developed were being implemented in units throughout the Army, and the harassment prevention programs she had designed were becoming standard training for all military police personnel. But perhaps most significantly, Elena had become a symbol of resilience and transformation within military circles. Her story was being used in leadership courses to demonstrate that setbacks could become foundations for greater success and that institutional problems could be solved when leaders had the courage to confront them directly. A knock on the door interrupted Elena's reflection. To her surprise, it was Lieutenant Colonel James Harper, her former commander, who had failed to support her during her first assignment at Fort Carson. Harper had requested this meeting through official channels, and Elena was curious about what he had to say after all these years. "Captain Martinez," he said, his tone respectful in a way it had never been during Elena's first assignment at Fort Carson. "Thank you for agreeing to see me. I know this might be uncomfortable given our history, but I felt it was important to speak with you personally." Elena gestured to a chair, maintaining her professional demeanor despite the complex emotions Harper's presence evoked. "Of course, sir. How can I help you?" Harper settled into the chair, clearly struggling with what he wanted to say. "I've been following your success here with great interest, and I want to acknowledge something that I should have recognized years ago. When you came to me with complaints about harassment and unsafe conditions, I dismissed your concerns and protected the very people who were trying to destroy your career." He paused, meeting Elena's eyes directly. "I was wrong. Completely and inexcusably wrong."
Elena appreciated the acknowledgement, but she was more interested in what Harper had learned from the experience. "Sir, what prompted this recognition?" "Two things," Harper replied. "First, seeing what you've accomplished here has made it clear that you were never the problem. The system that failed to protect you was the problem. Second, I've had 3 similar situations in my current command, and I've tried to handle them the way you're handling this unit. The results have been remarkable." Harper went on to explain how he had implemented Elena's leadership principles in his current assignment, creating accountability systems and zero-tolerance policies for harassment that had transformed his unit's culture. He had become an advocate for the reforms Elena had pioneered, using his senior rank to push for Army-wide adoption of her methods. "Captain Martinez," Harper said as their meeting concluded, "I want you to know that I consider your return to Fort Carson and your success here to be one of the most important developments in military leadership during my career. You've proven that institutional change is possible when leaders have the courage to pursue it and the competence to achieve it." As Harper left, Elena reflected on the irony of having her former antagonist become an advocate for her reforms. It was another example of how the culture she had created was expanding beyond the boundaries of her own unit to influence the broader military community. That evening, Elena took her customary walk through the unit area, observing the soldiers as they concluded their daily duties. The transformation was visible everywhere, in the pride soldiers took in their appearance and equipment, in the respectful but comfortable interactions between ranks, and in the sense of purpose that permeated every aspect of the unit's operations. As she completed her circuit, Elena encountered a group of junior soldiers gathered around a picnic table, engaged in animated discussion about a training exercise they were planning. What caught her attention wasn't the content of their conversation, but the dynamics. Natural leaders emerging through competence rather than intimidation, ideas being evaluated on their merit rather than their source, and genuine enthusiasm for excellence replacing the fear-based compliance that had once characterized the unit. Staff Sergeant Torres approached as Elena observed the scene. "Ma'am, it's amazing to watch them, isn't it? They don't even realize how special this environment is because it's all they've ever known here." Elena nodded, understanding exactly what Torres meant. The junior soldiers had never experienced the toxic culture that had once defined the unit. For them, professional leadership, mutual respect, and mission-focused excellence were simply normal aspects of military service. They were developing expectations and standards that they would carry with them throughout their careers, spreading the culture of excellence to every unit they joined. Staff Sergeant, that's exactly what I hope to achieve, creating a generation of soldiers who expect and demand the kind of leadership that brings out the best in people rather than breaking them down. As Elena returned to her quarters that night, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The naive lieutenant who had been destroyed by institutional betrayal had been reborn as a leader who understood that true strength came not from surviving adversity, but from using that experience to ensure others never had to endure what she had faced. Elena's story had become more than personal vindication. It had become proof that justice was possible within military institutions when leaders possessed the courage to pursue it and the competence to achieve it. She had transformed not just a single unit, but had contributed to changing the culture of an entire institution. The woman who had once been driven from Fort Carson in disgrace was now recognized as one of the military's most effective leaders. But more importantly, she had created a legacy that would protect and inspire future generations of soldiers. She had proven that sometimes the best revenge is not getting even, but getting better and lifting others up in the process. Elena Martinez had won more than just a battle against her former tormentors. She had won the war for the soul of military leadership, one soldier at a time, one unit at a time, one transformed life at a time. And that victory would endure long after her own career had ended, in the leaders she had developed and the culture she had created. The circle was finally complete, but the ripple effects of her transformation would continue spreading throughout the military for decades to come.